So what we wanted to talk about today are two, I think, really interesting things. The first thing is sort of how to progress from into an intermediate level in Spanish and beyond, and also talk a little bit about the learning strategies that comes with that, and maybe also touch on just a bit before that, just in case, because as a personal side note, I'm also learning Spanish this year, so
Oh
it
yeah,
would be fun if we could just take a few minutes to talk about how to get to the intermediate level, because I
yeah,
think although it's covered extensively in most apps and software is kind of aimed towards beginners, there's more than anyone. Um, just as a personal note, let's start there, shouldn't
sure,
we?
yeah, of course, yeah, yeah,
So I guess before we jump into all that, I guess we should just clear the introduction side of the way. And why are we even talking about Spanish? So why don't you talk us a little bit about your Spanish journey, as it were, and how you've now opened up your own website teaching
yeah.
Spanish?
I mean, Spanish was. It wasn't the first language. It was actually the third language I learned. It was after French and Italian, then came Spanish, and it became the language. I think one of my strongest languages over time. I think because I had a very good friend who was from the Canary Islands, which is part of Spain, and because of that friendship and the amount of time we spent together, basically, that I mean, Spanish became one of the languages that not only I was best at, but also was most meaningful for me in my life, and it became more than a kind of object of study, but just something that I lived and breathed every single day. And so I spent years. I never actually lived in a Spanish-speaking country, but I did just speak a lot of it, mostly in the UK. And then, after fairly recently, last year, I was kind of looking for ways to work more interactively with people, because it's cool to do blogging and podcasting, but I wanted to be able to interact a little bit more with people. And I thought, well, Spanish is a really popular language. It's one of the most popular languages among people that follow my work, and I'm also okay at it myself. So I thought, well, why not? Let's teach it, and let's help rather than another beginner's course. Why don't we look at the intermediate stage, which is where a lot of people end up struggling with Spanish. Especially in somewhere like the States, where you do a few years of college Spanish, but then don't get much further. I'm kind of interested in that and how to get through that point.
That's great. And of course, you started, I guess, this teaching path last year, or was the year before, with the short stories book. Also, the Spanish was the first one, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
And another way to learn in context. So that's great. So why do you think that the intermediate stages are, it seems, so much more difficult than the beginner stages? I mean, it's an obvious question, of course, but like, what is it? What are the pain points and struggle points that Spanish learners will hit once they reach that upper beginner level?
Yeah, I mean, well, the pain points are not unique to Spanish. The challenges typically you face across whatever language you learn. But you're right in what you said, which is that it's a perception. It's not necessarily reality. Like, Spanish doesn't suddenly get more difficult when you learn the conditional form of a verb. It's just what happens is that from a psychological perspective, you start a new language as a beginner, and then everything you learn, from like the hola to the como estás to the me llamo Olly, like, you learn something, you can use it straight away, right? It's like immediately you can put it into practice. The thing about the intermediate stage is that you start to study finer shades of meaning, right? So when you spend time learning grammar in a book or something like that, it's not so immediately useful. You have to learn, different verb forms, different tenses, alternative vocabulary, and so your visible, tangible progress slows down, and you get the effect on you is that you feel that you are just not progressing like you used to, and that kind of sucks. It's not a good feeling, and that can lead to loss of motivation and giving up. So that's So what that means is like two things. First of all, you just have to keep going, which is why motivation is so important. But also you need to change the way that you're studying. It doesn't really work anymore to simply learn a few phrases from your book and then start to use it. You have to expose yourself to the to the broader range of the language to start to learn that way.
Right. Can you give some examples of how people could do that? I suspect there are a lot of English speakers listening to this that would love to speak Spanish. Maybe they're from America, or they have friends in Latin America, or maybe they're in Europe where a lot of people also speak Spanish. So how can we become more efficient Spanish learners at that stage? Because I think the beginner level is extremely obvious what you should do.
Yeah.
Like, you should just add words, and if you're in doubt, there's like 20 million apps and courses and websites. You're never going to run out of beginner resources ever. But once you pass that beginner level, also maybe it's hard to know what you're missing, because you don't know what you don't know, right? So like, how do you,
the kind of heightened awareness problem, which is what leads to that kind of frustration. Yeah, so I mean, basically you have to take the view, okay, you need to study the whole language. It's actually a technical term, that the whole language, as opposed to learning individual words and phrases. So in practical terms, that means that yes, you have to speak a lot, but you already know that, right? If you want to get good at speaking Spanish, you have to be speaking Spanish regularly.
Well, I mean, you say that, and you look at university degrees and other kind of traditional ways of learning languages. Maybe it's worth repeating, that you should just be speaking the language in order to get better at speaking it.
Yeah, and it's true that it's not everyone's ambition to be a kind of the person who just speaks Spanish. Some people just enjoy reading and consuming the language, and that absolutely fine. But if you want to get good at speaking Spanish, you have to actually be speaking. Right. And it seems like an obvious point, but you'd be amazed how many people have the mentality of, well, I'll speak when I'm ready, or just learn a little bit more and then start speaking. So yeah, that's part number one. But in order to inform, there's only so much you can learn from speaking. Because let's say you speak every day. Well, how long are you going to speak for? Like half an hour? If you're speaking Spanish for half an hour every day on Skype or something, I mean, that's not many people can manage that kind of intensity. But even then, in half an hour of spoken Spanish, you don't get that much input, really. I mean, for a start, you're speaking half the time, which cuts it down to 15 minutes. And then the kind of Spanish that's used in speech is a very kind of poor representation of the language as a whole. That's not the complete language. And so really, when you look at it over the long term, the only way you can really progress from that lower intermediate stage and push through the barrier is by having huge amounts of input, which means you have to read a lot and you have to listen a lot. Mm-hmm. On a very simple level, that's what you've got to do.
Well, it sounds very easy.
Yeah. So the problem is, of course, that okay, you listen to that piece of advice. Okay, read a lot and listen a lot. Okay, fine. So what do? You download podcasts and you don't understand anything because it's too fast. You watch movies, don't understand anything because it's all kind of weird topics. You read books, but you don't understand anything because it's too advanced. Yeah. That's the problem you run into from a practical standpoint for the intermediate learner. So the really hard thing to do, usually, in Spanish and most other languages as well, is to actually find the material that's right at your level, such that you can sit down and study for an hour and it's actually useful and beneficial for you. Because if you spend an hour listening to something that's above your head, you're essentially wasting your time.
Not that it doesn't do that.
Not that it doesn't have some
latent
value, but yeah, you get bored and you're not learning anything. You need to have material that makes the language accessible to you.
Yeah, and has to challenge you also, because if you're speaking with the same tutor every day, for instance, you might use like 95% of the same vocabulary over and over and over. So you have this, I guess, false level in a way, because you can speak for an hour, but you're speaking the same hour every day.
And this is where speaking kind of gets, when you're a beginner in a language, speaking every day gives you massive benefits. You grow a bit of confidence, you start to learn to chit chat. But what a lot of people find is that those kind of daily conversations start to get very repetitive after you've been doing them for a few months, right? And that's a difficult stage, and that's when you need to kind of turn to more conventional forms of study, listening and reading, because what most people find, unless you're immersed in unless you live in Spain or something, and you're immersed in that environment, you're just not getting the richness of input that you require. Your conversations might be very repetitive. You say the same things all the time, and that's the limit. Those are the limitations of speaking, and so that's why it becomes much more important to have an intelligent approach to study, especially in terms of the listening and the reading, that input side of stuff, and that's why it becomes particularly important to find the right materials. And what you're typically aiming for is what's usually branded as comprehensible input. Like that's the term that's usually banded around, which ideally is material that's at your current level plus a little bit. Mm-hmm. So you already understand a fair bit, but there's just a little bit more that you don't know yet, and because you might understand already the bulk of it. Using that context, it makes it much easier to learn those few things that you don't quite know yet. So that's typically where you wanna pitch your learning material.
Right, it's about filling in the blanks in a way, because you know all the words surrounding a word, then you can kind of learn it easier. You see it in context, and you can sometimes even guess the meaning based on that. But these kind of materials sometimes can be hard to find. There's not a segue or anything, but where should people look for that in general?
No, but it's genuinely hard to find because materials intended for native speakers, I mean, they just generally don't serve you. I mean,
it's impossible to understand.
It helps to watch, to have, relax in the evening with a movie. It's better to watch a movie in Spanish than in English, right? Why not?
Sure.
But yeah, those materials are hard to find, and that's, I mean, Spanish is one of the, given that we're talking about Spanish, it's one of the most well-served languages of all. That's where all the, you'd be hard pressed to think of a language that is well-served in terms of language materials than Spanish. And yet, you still, in my Facebook group, like the most common question that comes up is, hey, where can I get some good Spanish listening practice, or where can I get some good Spanish reading practice? And there is, I mean, to be fair, there is a lot of good stuff out there, but you've got to kind of dig around and take a little bit here and a little bit there, and it's difficult to find a kind of to have a kind of learning hub, if you like, of stuff, which is why obviously I ended up making the Fluent Spanish Academy for that very reason, because there's nothing more frustrating than having to spend, every day when you sit down to study, to think, okay, well, what shall I learn? What shall I study today? And then start Googling stuff, and then you end up on YouTube, and then before you know it, like the evening's gone and you've done nothing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and it's a problem too, because sometimes the beginner material is very unnatural. So they will have sentences. You will learn material sentences that would never be used in the actual day-to-day life of a native speaker. So in a sense, it's kind of like you're bridging between your previous language and Spanish instead of actually learning Spanish, which I saw as...
I think it depends on the quality of the material, doesn't it? Because
sure,
you got some great... there's some really fantastic beginner Spanish material out there. I mean, interestingly, I've never actually found a beginner Spanish textbook that I thought was any good. There's a fair amount of good online beginner Spanish stuff out there. So it does depend. I mean, like some places do teach very natural Spanish. Others, of course, don't. But yeah,
it just seems like there's a huge gap between the beginners materials that teach you the basics, and then native materials, which are like a native would listen to. It just doesn't.
Right, yeah.
It seems like it's really difficult to find, let's say, a podcast that's spoken at a sort of natural vocabulary and level, but perhaps not 100% speed or something. People slow down a little bit, maybe not use super technical terms. What do I know? I don't know how to do this. But
but they do exist. I mean, they do exist. There's some good stuff out there. But yeah, I mean, again, it's all a big mix. And one of the most common things, of course, is that people either don't know where to find stuff or end up having this kind of butterfly syndrome. I mean, the number of people, me myself, number of times I've kind of gone online to look for some material and just ended up going down this huge rabbit hole of YouTube videos and stuff like this, right? And so it's finding that, knowing where to find the material, getting that material, knowing that, and then of course you need to know how to study with it, and then of course even once you get to that point, even once you've got the material, you know how to study with it, then you kind of need the stick-to-itiveness to actually do it every day such that you get a result, because obviously having the best material in the world and even knowing how to use it means nothing unless you actually do it. And that's where, again, it's a common stumbling block.
Yeah, and I think that's a point that I make sometimes, is that it's better to have, let's say, a slightly less effective, theoretically, method that you would do all the time than it is to have the best of the best that you would never use.
Yeah, exactly. Don't let the great get in the way of the good. It's like you can apply this thing so widely. Yeah, the thing that you do every day, or the mediocre thing that you do every day, is far more powerful than the that perfect method that you do once a month or something like that.
Right, exactly. But you mentioned your Fluent Spanish Academy, which is of course one of the things we're talking about. And can you just give? I haven't seen it yet, so what can people expect to find on the inside? Like, how's it built up? Is there a guided kind of a way to go through the materials, or is it more like all you can eat?
Well, what it's not is a course. It's not a kind of intermediate Spanish course, because as we were talking about earlier, the most important thing at intermediate level is that you stop doing this. You stop studying in the way that you were studying as a beginner. It's like changing that mentality is really crucial. So there's a lot of different elements to it, but essentially there are three different parts. Like the first part is a huge amount of material. So I've created what I consider to be the best intermediate Spanish material on the planet, and I don't say that lightly, but I put a lot of thought into what material I would want to study as an intermediate Spanish. And so, for example, authentic conversations with word-for-word transcripts, short stories that I've created focusing on specific grammar points, audio lessons where we teach Spanish phrases that are genuinely useful for that intermediate stage, stuff that's actually spoken. So there's a huge bank of materials. There is live training, so every month I do live training course where I teach these like study techniques and strategies. I say, like, here's how to study. Like, you've got the material, like, here's how to improve your listening. Here's how to understand native speakers. Here's how to read effectively. Here's how to memorize vocabulary, so that people know what to do with the material. And then thirdly, there's the community that we have, which is a very, very active, thriving Facebook group where we have monthly challenges, which range from everything from like the current month where we're having a simple daily study challenge. So the idea is basically do something every day,
right?
A general motivational thing, to what's coming up next month, which is going to focus on a specific Spanish grammar point. And so the idea is, okay, like this month we're all going to focus on improving understanding the difference between the imperfecto and the pretérito, which is the imperfect and the simple past, because that's one of the most commonly confused areas of Spanish grammar. So it's the combination of the materials you need, the know-how and how to do it, and the community that makes sure you actually do it. And like for me, those are the three key, like the absolute cornerstones of learning a language at the intermediate levels: having the material, knowing what to do with it, and then keeping going and actually doing the work. So that's what the academy is designed to provide.
Cool. And of course you would keep adding stuff to it, and that way.
Yeah, so there's a schedule, there's a whole schedule of ongoing things. So there's weekly audio lessons. There are new short stories that come out every month, listening tracks with transcriptions, live training every month, the ongoing challenges. I mean, one of the things that I'm kind of clear about is that there's no quick fix to this. Like, there's no intermediate Spanish course that you take and then suddenly you're fluent. Like, the way that I became fluent in Spanish was working hard at it over time. And I don't try to dodge that point, and people who are kind of looking for a quick fix are not probably ready for something like this. You do have to put in the work, and so the best service that I can provide from my perspective is the service that gets people excited about it, gives them what they need, and makes sure they carry on and do that.
Awesome. I really like the idea also of having the community where you can be accountable to someone other than yourself, and you can kind of see what others are struggling with, because it's usually similar things, isn't it? And
yeah, and we do things like we have we try and build in that accountability on a lot of different ways. So, for example, we have these months, we have the community where people get to know each other and exchange ideas, and some people like kind of figure out they're living close to each other, so they get together and speak Spanish. And then we have the monthly challenges, but then we also have accountability partners. So we'll have someone who is like, you'll be paired up with someone else who you chat to over Messenger or something, to make sure that you're doing that thing every day that we've set out to do in the challenge. So, you know, I really do my very best to make sure that people get that kind of every small, tiny little thing that they need to keep going and to do it. And I think like that's. I mean, all I can say is I wish I had that when I was when I first got started.
So where can people go to find out more about learning Spanish and the Fluent Spanish Academy?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, in terms of learning Spanish, I've got endless articles that I've written on how I learned Spanish, my recommendations. I've got stuff on my blog, on YouTube, on the Huffington Post as well. So, Kris, maybe you want to put some links on this page for people to follow. In terms of the Fluent Spanish Academy, we're not always open. In fact, the default is that we're closed, but we might have spots opening up. We have a waiting list at the moment where you can join and get free samples, so you can see, you know, you can get some samples of the material to see whether that's it's the right kind of thing for you. Again, Kris, if you want to put a link on this page somewhere for people to follow, feel free to click over to the homepage and download the free samples, see what you think, and if it's a good fit for you. And if you've been, it's not for complete beginners, but if you've been learning Spanish for a while and you'd like a bit of help to, you know, get through the intermediate stage, then we'd love to have you involved.
Great. And yeah, I'll put the links in the YouTube description, and I'll also put it in the blog post itself under resources. So we'll have them all linked up there so people can go and learn Spanish, or at least improve their Spanish.
Yeah, bit by bit, right?
Exactly, day by day.
As I say in Spanish, el camino se hace al caminar, which is you forge the path by walking.
Okay. And vamos, you know, that's what they also say.
They say some other things as well. It's not just el camino se hace el caminar. Vamos.
Oh, well, thank you so much for giving us the tips and tricks on Spanish, Olly. And I hope to be a member of your academy soon when I've learned the fundamentals of Spanish. And I hope to have many more questions for you at that time.
We'll be waiting.
Fantastic.